The security guard's hand clamped down on the elderly woman's frail shoulder with brutal force. "Ma'am, you need to leave." Now, her weathered fingers trembled as she clutched a crumpled invitation, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Please, my son," he invited me. ... But the guard's radio crackled to life. "Remove the vagrant immediately." What they didn't know was that upstairs, in the penthouse boardroom, her son was about to sign the biggest deal of his life. He had no idea his mother was being dragged away in handcuffs below. In 20 minutes, when he discovered what they'd done, the entire corporate empire would tremble. The gleaming marble lobby of Meridian Tower stretched before her like a cathedral of glass and steel, its ceiling disappearing into shadows 40 stories above. She clutched the embossed invitation card with both hands, her arthritic fingers leaving slight impressions on the expensive paper. "Mom, please come. It's important. The biggest day of my career. I need you there." David, the handwritten note. Beneath the formal invitation, details made her heart swell. After 3 years of barely speaking, her son had reached out. David Chen, CEO of Chen Technologies, wanted his mother at his company's merger celebration. Margaret smoothed down her best dress, a simple navy blue outfit she'd worn to church for the past 5 years. She'd spent her entire morning getting ready. The invitation specified the 42nd floor executive conference room. "Excuse me," a voice cut through her reverence. Margaret looked up to see a security guard, approaching tall, broad-shouldered, with cold gray eyes that swept over her like she was debris on his pristine floor. "I'm here for the merger celebration," Margaret said softly, holding up her invitation. "My son David invited me." The guard, his nameplate read Morrison, barely glanced at the card. His gaze lingered instead on her worn shoes, her slightly frayed dress, the way she clutched her small purse like a lifeline. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification." Margaret fumbled through her purse, producing a weathered driver's license. Morrison examined it with theatrical suspicion, as if she'd handed him a counterfeit bill. "Margaret Chen," he read aloud, "and you're claiming to be related to David Chen." "I'm his mother." A smirk played across Morrison's lips. He'd worked security at Meridian Tower for 8 years, and he knew David Chen by Sai-Chung Sharp, always impeccably, dressed in $1,000 suits. This woman looked like she cleaned offices, not birthed tech billionaires. "Right?" Morrison's tone dripped skepticism. "And I'm the Queen of England." Behind the security desk, his partner Jake looked up from his monitors. "Problem, Morrison. Just another one trying to crash the party upstairs. Claims she's David Chen's mother." Morrison chuckled, loud enough for other people in the lobby to hear. A few business-suited executives turned to stare. Margaret's cheeks flushed. "Please, I have an invitation. Look at it properly." Morrison made a show of examining the card again, then shook his head. "Anyone can print these up." "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "But my son, your son, isn't David Chen." Morrison's voice grew harder. "Now, you can walk out on your own, or I can escort you. Your choice." 42 floors above, David Chen stood at the head of a mahogany conference table, facing 12 of the most powerful executives in Silicon Valley. The merger with Titan Industries would make Chen Technologies the largest cybersecurity firm on the West Coast. But every few seconds, his eyes drifted to the empty chair he'd saved for his mother. She'd promised to come. After their bitter falling out, 3 years ago, after he'd accused her of not understanding his world, of embarrassing him at corporate functions with her simple ways, he'd finally swallowed his pride. The invitation had been his olive branch. David Richard Blackwood, Titan Industries CEO, raised an eyebrow. "Shall we proceed with the signing?" Just ... give me 1 more minute." David pulled out his phone, checking for messages. Nothing from his mother. Back in the lobby, Margaret's voice grew desperate. "Call David and ask, 'Ma'am, you're causing a disturbance.'" Morrison moved closer, his hand resting on his radio. "Security to all units. We have a situation in the main lobby." The words echoed through the vast space. Other visitors stopped their conversations. Phones came out to record. Margaret felt the weight of their stares, the judgment in their whispers. "Look at her," someone murmured. "Probably homeless. How did she even get in here?" Margaret's hands shook as she held up the invitation one more time. "This is real. My son David wrote me a note. See, it's his handwriting. Morrison snatched the card from her hands, examining it under the lobby's harsh lights. The paper was genuine Meridian Tower, stationery. The embossing was perfect. "Ma'am, I don't know how you got this, but I didn't steal it," Margaret whispered. "David is my son. I raised him. I worked 3 jobs to put him through Stanford. Security. This is Morrison. I need backup in the main lobby. We have an individual who's refusing to leave and is becoming agitated." Margaret wasn't agitated. She was heartbroken. The son she'd sacrificed everything for, the boy she'd raised alone after his father died, was somewhere in this building, waiting for her. "Just let me go upstairs. If David doesn't know me, I'll leave. I promise." Morrison's radio crackled. "Backup on the way. Remove her from the premises immediately." 2 more security guards emerged from elevators, their boots clicking against the marble floor. Margaret looked around desperately, seeing the faces of strangers recording her humiliation, seeing the way they looked at her like she was nothing. Upstairs, David Chen was trying to focus on contract clauses, but his mother's absence gnawed at him. Margaret Chen had never broken a promise in her life. When she said she'd be somewhere, she was there at every school play, every graduation, every achievement, until their relationship fractured. He'd been ashamed of her once, ashamed of her accent, her simple clothes, the way she'd beam with pride when she told people about her son's success. He'd thought she didn't belong in his world of corporate dinners and tech conferences. Now, staring at her empty chair, he wondered if he'd been wrong about everything. Sir Morrison's voice was firm as he approached Margaret. "You need to come with us." "No," Margaret took a step back. "I'm not leaving. My son needs me." "Ma'am, your son doesn't need you. You're not his mother, and you're trespassing." Morrison grabbed her arm. Margaret cried out, more from shock than pain. "Get your hands off me," Margaret said, her voice stronger now. But Morrison was already radioing for police backup. In his mind, this was simplesome. Delusional woman had somehow gotten a hold of a fake invitation and was now resisting removal. He'd seen it before. What he hadn't seen was the elevator door opening on the 42nd floor, or David Chen stepping out with a troubled expression, finally coming to look for his mother himself. In spectacular fashion, David Chen's Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor as he stepped out of the executive elevator. The merger documents were signed. Champagne was being poured 42 floors above, but all he could think about was the empty chair where his mother should have been sitting. The lobby buzzed with activity, but something felt wrong. A crowd had gathered near the security desk, phones held high, recording something. David's stomach dropped as he caught fragments of conversation. ... Old woman causing trouble. ... Claims to be someone's mother. ... Double quotes. ... Security single quotes is handling it. David pushed through the crowd, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he saw her small, dignified Margaret Chen standing between 2 security guards, her navy dress wrinkled, her face streaked with tears, the world tilted sideways. "Mom." The word cut through the lobby noise like a blade. Every conversation stopped. Every phone camera swiveled toward him. Morrison, who had been reaching for his handcuffs, froze mid-motion. Margaret's head snapped up. "David," her voice cracked with relief and heartbreak. "I tried to come upstairs. I have the invitation, but they won't." "Ma'am, step back," Morrison barked, still not connecting the dots. "Sir, we're handling this situation. This woman has been causing a disturbance." David stared at Morrison with an expression that could have flashed frozen lava. "This woman," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "is my mother." The color drained from Morrison's face. Behind him, Jake was frantically checking computer screens, pulling up employee files, trying to find David Chen's emergency contacts. Margaret Chen, same last name, same address, listed as next of kin. That's impossible," Morrison stammered. "She doesn't. I mean, look at her. ... Look at her." David's voice rose, echoing off the marble walls. "What exactly am I supposed to see when I look at my mother? Morrison." The security guard's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, phones capturing every second of his professional destruction. "David, please," Margaret whispered. "Don't make a scene. I'll just go home." "No." David moved between his mother and Morrison, his body language shifting into the commanding presence that had built a tech empire. "You're not going anywhere, Mom. You belong here more than anyone." He turned back to Morrison, and his voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "You put your hands on my mother, sir. I was just doing my job. She didn't have proper identification. She had an invitation, with my personal note on it." Morrison's hand shook as he held up the crumpled card. "Anyone could have forged this. How was I supposed to know? By doing your job properly, instead of judging people by their clothes." David took the invitation from Morrison's trembling fingers. "This is Meridian Tower stationery, premium stock, the kind that costs $50 per sheet and can't be duplicated. The embossing is done with a machine that only 3 companies in the city own. But you didn't check any of that, did you?" Jake was pulling up security footage on his monitor, rewinding to when Margaret first entered. On the screen, they could see her approaching Morrison politely, presenting her invitation, being dismissed without proper examination. "Oh God," Jake muttered. "Morrison, you didn't even scan the invitation. Protocol requires." "Shut up, Jake." Morrison's face was flushed red. "I've been doing this job for 8 years. I know how to spot trouble." "Trouble." David stepped closer. "My 73-year-old mother, who raised me alone, who worked as a seamstress, a house cleaner, and a cafeteria worker to put me through school sees trouble." Margaret touched her son's arm. "David, please, let's just go upstairs." But David was just getting started. 8 years of corporate warfare had taught him how to dismantle an opponent completely, and Morrison had made the fatal mistake of humiliating the one person David loved most in the world. "Tell me, Morrison, what's the protocol for invitation verification?" Morrison glanced desperately at Jake, who was studiously avoiding eye contact. We check the validity, ... How? Visual inspection? And what else? Silence. Computer verification, Jake supplied quietly. "We're supposed to scan invitations against the guest list database." "Which you didn't do," David's voice was surgeon precise. "What else?" Morrison was sweating now. "If there's any doubt, we contact the host for confirmation," which you also didn't do. David pulled out his phone. "Instead, you decided my mother was lying. Based on what, exactly? Her appearance, her age, the fact that she doesn't wear designer clothes." The crowd was dead silent, hanging on every word. This wasn't just about a security mistake anymore. This was about dignity, respect, and the assumptions people made about worth based on appearances. "Sir, I apologize for any misunderstanding." Misunderstanding? David's composure finally cracked. "You grabbed my mother. You were going to arrest her. You humiliated her in front of hundreds of people because you decided she didn't look like she belonged in the same building as your bosses." Margaret was crying now, but not from sadness. She was crying because her son, the boy who'd been embarrassed by her simple ways, who distanced himself from her world, was defending her with everything he had. Morrison made one last desperate play. "Sir, we have protocols." She matched the profile of individuals who sometimes try to gain unauthorized access. "What profile?" David's voice could have cut diamond. "Elderly, Asian, working class. Which part of my mother's existence triggered your protocol?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Morrison realized he'd walked into a trap with no way out. Any answer would expose the ugly truth of his assumptions. Jake was frantically typing at his computer. "David, sir, I've pulled up the guest verification logs. Standard protocol wasn't followed. The invitation was never scanned, never verified against the database, and no confirmation call was made. And the security footage shows Mrs. Chen being cooperative throughout the encounter until physical contact was initiated." David turned back to Morrison, whose career was dissolving in real time. "Where's your supervisor? Mr. Hendricks is upstairs at the party. Call him down now." Morrison's radio shook in his hands. "Control to Mr. Hendricks. Please report to the main lobby immediately." Within minutes, James Hendricks, head of building security, emerged from an elevator. Saw the crowd, saw David Chen's thunderous expression, and immediately understood that someone had made a career-ending mistake. "Mr. Chen, what's the situation?" "Your employee just physically restrained my mother and attempted to have her arrested for the crime of trying to attend my merger celebration." Hendricks looked at Morrison, at the phone cameras still recording, at Margaret Chen's tear-stained face, and felt his own job security evaporating. Morrison stepped away from the situation immediately. He turned to David. "Sir, I sincerely apologize. This is absolutely unacceptable. Unacceptable doesn't begin to cover it." David put his arm around his mother's shoulders. "This man decided my mother was a criminal based on her appearance. He never followed basic verification protocols. He humiliated her in public and put his hands on her against her will." Margaret looked up at her son, seeing not the distant CEO who'd grown ashamed of his humble beginnings, but the boy she'd raised to fight for what was right. The boy who'd once promised to protect her the way she'd protected him. "What do you want me to do, sir?" Hendricks asked, though he already knew Morrison's fate was sealed. David looked down at his mother, then back at the man who'd tried to throw her out like garbage. "I want justice. And I want everyone in this building to understand that respect isn't determined by the price of someone's clothes." Morrison was about to discover that some mistakes have consequences that echo far beyond a single moment of poor judgment. The executive elevator carried David, Margaret, and James Hendricks to the 42nd floor in suffocating silence. Below them, Morrison stood in the lobby like a man awaiting execution, his radio silent, his authority stripped away by a single phone call from Hendricks. Suspended pending investigation, Hendricks had announced to the crowd, effective immediately. But David Chen wasn't finished, not even close. The merger celebration was in full swing when they entered the conference room. Titan Industries executives, venture capitalists, and tech moguls turned as David walked in with his mother on his arm. The contrast was stark. Margaret, in her simple navy dress, among women wearing jewelry worth more than most people's cars. "Ladies and gentlemen," David's voice carried across the room with absolute authority, "I'd like you to meet someone very important. This is my mother, Margaret Chen." The room buzzed with polite applause, but David could see the subtle glances, the whispered questions. Some of these people had known him for years and had never heard him mention family. Richard Blackwood, CEO of Titan Industries, approached with a practiced smile. "Mrs. Chen, what a pleasure. David's told us so much about you." Margaret looked up at her son, confusion flickering in her eyes. David had never mentioned her to these people. For 3 years, he'd kept his background buried, ashamed of the woman who'd sacrificed everything for his success. "Actually, Richard, I haven't talked about my mother nearly enough." David's voice grew stronger. "Let me fix that right now." He guided Margaret to the head of the conference table, the same spot where he'd signed the biggest deal of his career an hour earlier. But suddenly, that deal seemed insignificant compared to the debt he owed the woman beside him. "My mother came to America with nothing. She was 19, pregnant, and her husband, my father, died in a construction accident when I was 2 years old." David's voice filled the silent room. "She could have given up. She could have sent me back to Taiwan to live with relatives. Instead, she worked 3 jobs to keep us together." Margaret's hand found her son's arm, squeezing gently. She'd never heard him tell this story before. For years, he'd acted like his success sprang from nowhere, like he'd built his empire without help. "She cleaned offices at night so she could be home when I got out of school. She took in sewing work on weekends. She sold homemade dumplings to neighbors to pay for my textbooks." David looked around the room at faces that had never known struggle. "When I got into Stanford, she took out loans against our apartment. When those weren't enough, she sold her wedding ring, the only thing she had left of my father." The room was absolutely silent. Several executives shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of their expensive watches and designer suits. "I graduated summa cum laude and started Chen Technologies with $50,000. Want to know where that money came from?" David paused, letting the question hang. "My mother mortgaged our apartment. Everything she'd worked for her entire life, she bet on me." Margaret was crying now, but she was also proud. This was the son she'd raised, not the one who'd been embarrassed by her accent at corporate dinners, but the one who understood sacrifice and gratitude. The company went public 5 years ago. "We're worth $2.8 billion today. And do you know what my mother asked for in return for her investment, her sacrifice, her faith in me?" David's voice cracked slightly. "Nothing. She asked for nothing except the chance to be proud of her son." Richard Blackwood cleared his throat. "David, she sounds like a remarkable woman. She is, which is why what happened downstairs is unforgivable." The mood in the room shifted. This wasn't just a heartwarming family story anymore. 30 minutes ago, While you were all up here celebrating our success, my mother was being physically restrained by building security. She was treated like a criminal for the crime of trying to attend her son's merger celebration." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Margaret squeezed David's arm, trying to signal him to stop, but he was beyond stopping. The security guard, Morrison, decided, "My mother didn't belong in this building based on her appearance. He never verified her invitation. He never followed protocol." He grabbed her, humiliated her in front of hundreds of people, and was preparing to have her arrested. "Jesus," someone whispered. "My mother, who sacrificed everything so I could stand in this room with you today, was judged unworthy of basic respect because she doesn't look like your idea of success." David pulled out his phone and scrolled to the security footage. Hendricks had sent him the room. Watched in horrified silence as Morrison dismissed Margaret, grabbed her arm, called for backup. This is what prejudice looks like in practice. This is what happens when we decide someone's worth based on their clothes, their age, their accent, their neighborhood. Margaret watched the faces around her powerful people who suddenly looked very small. She'd spent 3 years believing she didn't belong in David's world. Now she was beginning to understand that maybe the problem wasn't her. "David," Richard Blackwood said carefully, "what can we do to make this right? You can start by understanding that this isn't an isolated incident. How many other people get dismissed, disrespected, or worse because they don't fit someone's narrow definition of who belongs where?" David turned to face the room fully. "We just signed a deal that makes us one of the most powerful tech companies in the world. We have influence, resources, responsibility. The question is, what are we going to do with it?" Victoria Sterling, a venture capitalist known for her sharp tongue, spoke up. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we remember where we came from. I'm proposing we use our success to lift people up instead of building walls to keep them out." David looked at his mother, then back at the room. "And I'm proposing we start by making sure what happened to my mother never happens to anyone else." Margaret stood up slowly, her voice soft but clear. "May I say something?" The room turned to her with the kind of attention usually reserved for keynote speakers and heads of state. "I'm not angry at that security guard. I'm sad for him." Her accent was stronger when she was emotional, but no one seemed to notice anymore. "He looked at me and saw someone who didn't matter, someone disposable. But I raised a son who built something beautiful, something that gives people jobs and creates technology that helps others." She paused, gathering strength. "I may not look like I belong in this fancy building, but I helped build the man who built the company that built the future you're all investing in. My hands may be old and rough from work, but they fed the mind that created Chen Technologies." The room was absolutely silent. Several people were openly emotional. "So yes, I belong here. Not because my son is successful, but because I helped make that success possible. And every person like me, every cleaner, every seamstress, every parent working 3 jobs to give their children a chance, they belong wherever their contributions have taken root." Margaret sat back down, her heart pounding. She'd never spoken to a room full of billionaires before, but she'd raised a son who conquered the tech world. Surely she could handle a few venture capitalists. David looked at his mother with absolute awe. This was the woman he'd been embarrassed by. This was the person he'd thought wasn't sophisticated enough for his world. Richard Blackwood broke the silence. "Mrs. Chen, your son is lucky to have you, and frankly, we're lucky to be in business with someone who was raised with those values. The question," David said, his voice steady now, "is whether we're going to let those values guide how we do business going forward." He looked around the room at faces that would help shape the future of technology, of business, of how power was wielded in America. Because Morrison's mistake wasn't just about disrespecting my mother, it was about a system that teaches people to judge worth by appearances, and we have the power to change that system. Margaret Chen, who had been dismissed as worthless an hour earlier, was about to become the catalyst for a revolution in how one of America's most powerful companies treated human dignity. The merger celebration was about to become something much more significant than anyone had imagined. The news broke at 6:47 p.m. Pacific Time. A video titled "Tech Billionaire's Mother, Humiliated by Security," hit social media like a digital tsunami. Within an hour, it had been shared 50,000 times. By midnight, it was trending worldwide. The footage was devastating. Phone cameras had captured every moment Margaret Chen's dignified pleas. But what made the video truly explosive was the 15-minute line that followed, broadcast by a tech journalist who'd been attending the merger celebration. David Chen, flanked by his mother and the most powerful executives in Silicon Valley, making an impromptu declaration that would reshape corporate America's approach to dignity and respect. Effective immediately, David had announced to the cameras Chen Technologies is implementing the Margaret Chen Protocol. Every policy will be reviewed through the lens of dignity and inclusion. And we're establishing a $10 million fund to support organizations fighting discrimination based on appearance, age, and socioeconomic status. By morning, the story had legs of its own. Morrison woke up to find his face on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle under the headline, "The Security Guard Who Grabbed the Wrong Mother." His phone buzzed incessantly with calls from reporters, friends, and former colleagues. His wife, Sarah, sat at their kitchen table staring at her laptop screen in horror. "Jim, they're calling for you to be fired everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, even LinkedIn. There's a petition with 40,000 signatures already." Morrison slumped into a chair, still in yesterday's uniform. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret Chen's face, not angry or vindictive, but sad, disappointed, like a mother watching her child make a terrible mistake. "I was doing my job," he mumbled, but the words felt hollow even to him. "Were you?" Sarah's voice was sharp. "Because I watched that video, Jim. That woman showed you an invitation. She told you her son invited her, and you decided she was lying because of what her clothes. Her age." Morrison had no answer. In 8 years of security work, he'd never questioned his gut instincts about people. Rich people belonged upstairs. Poor people needed watching. It was that simple. Except it wasn't simple at all. Meanwhile, at Meridian Tower, emergency meetings were happening on every floor. Property manager Vincent Torres paced his office, while his assistant fielded calls from reporters, corporate tenants, and protesters who were already gathering outside. "Sir, Chen Technologies is threatening to break their lease," his assistant reported. "They're saying they can't operate in a building that doesn't align with their values." Torres rubbed his temples. Chen Technologies occupied 6 floors and paid nearly $2 million annually in rent. Losing them would be catastrophic. But they weren't the only ones expressing concerns. What about the other tenants? Mixed reactions. Some are supportive of Chen's position. Others are worried about protests affecting business. And sir, there's something else. Building Services just reported that 3 cleaning staff members have filed complaints about discriminatory treatment. They're saying security has been harassing them for months, questioning their right to be in certain areas, even though they're employees. Torres felt his stomach drop. Morrison's treatment of Margaret Chen wasn't an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern. Across town, Margaret Chen sat in her small apartment, overwhelmed by the attention. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing. Reporters wanted interviews. Lawyers offered to represent her in lawsuits. David had hired a publicist to help manage the media requests, but Margaret felt lost in the chaos. She'd become a symbol overnight, the dignified face of working. "Mom, you don't have to do any of this," David said, sitting beside her on the worn couch where he'd done. "Homework as a child, we can make it all go away." "Can we?" Margaret looked at her son with eyes that had seen too much of the world's cruelty. "David, that security guard didn't wake up yesterday planning to humiliate an old woman. He did it because he's been taught that people like me don't matter. Making it go away won't change that." David studied his mother's face. Even now, after everything she'd endured, she was thinking about others who might face the same treatment. "What do you want to do?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I want to meet with him, Morrison." "Mom, why would you? Because someone needs to help him understand what he did, and maybe someone needs to help him understand why he did it." The request seemed impossible, but David had learned never to underestimate his mother's wisdom. Within hours, arrangements were made through lawyers and mediators. Morrison, facing termination and possible criminal charges, agreed to the meeting as part of a restorative justice process. They met in a neutral conference room at a community center in Oakland. Morrison arrived with his lawyer and union representative, expecting confrontation. Instead, he found Margaret Chen sitting calmly at a table with tea and cookies she'd baked herself. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. Morrison couldn't meet her eyes. Mrs. Chen, I want to apologize. What I did was wrong. Yes, it was, but I'm not here for an apology. Margaret poured tea into 2 cups. I'm here because I want to understand something. When you looked at me yesterday, what did you see? The question caught Morrison off guard. His lawyer had prepared him for accusations, demands, legal threats. Not this quiet curiosity. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. When I walked into that lobby, you made a decision about who I was before I said a word. What did you see that made you decide I didn't belong there? Morrison squirmed in his chair. I saw someone who looked out of place. Out of place how? Your clothes, the way you carried yourself. You looked like he stopped. Realizing the trap he was walking into. Like what, Mr. Morrison? Like someone who cleans buildings instead of owning them. The honesty hung in the air like a confession. Morrison's lawyer winced, but Margaret nodded approvingly. There it is. You saw someone who works with her hands, someone who doesn't, wear expensive clothes, someone who looked like she belonged downstairs instead of upstairs. And you decided that made me less worthy of respect. Morrison finally met her eyes. I'm sorry, I believe you are. But sorry isn't enough. Margaret leaned forward. He shook his head. I see someone who's been taught that people's worth depends on their appearance. Someone who's been trained to see the world as us and them, upstairs and downstairs, worthy and unworthy. Her voice grew sadder. I see someone who's never been taught that dignity is something every person carries inside them, regardless of their job or their clothes or their bank account. Morrison felt something crack inside his chest. This woman, this person he'd humiliated and grabbed and tried to arrest, was showing him more compassion than he'd shown her. I don't know how to. I mean, I've been doing security for 8 years. I thought I was good at reading people. You are good at reading people. You just learned to read the wrong things. Margaret reached across the table and touched his hand briefly. Mr. Morrison, what happened yesterday is going to change your life. The question is, are you going to let it make you bitter, or are you going to let it make you better? Morrison stared at this remarkable woman who held his future in her hands. She could destroy him completely with a single lawsuit, a single demand for prosecution. Instead, she was offering him something he'd never expected, a chance at redemption. What would you want me to do? Margaret smiled for the first time since they'd met. I want you to help make sure this never happens to anyone else. The meeting that was supposed to be about punishment was about to become something far more powerful, a partnership that would transform how America thought about dignity, respect, and second chances. 6 months later, Morrison stood in front of 200 security professionals at the National Security Conference in Chicago. His hands no longer shook when he spoke publicly, that had stopped after the 30th presentation, but his voice still carried the weight of someone who'd learned the hardest lesson of his life in the most public way possible. My name is James Morrison, and 6 months ago, I was the most hated security guard in America. A ripple of recognition went through the audience. Everyone in the industry knew the story. The video had become required viewing in training programs across the country. I grabbed an elderly woman and tried to have her arrested because I decided she didn't belong in the building where I worked. I made that decision in 3 seconds, based entirely on her appearance. Morrison's voice was steady now, but genuine. That woman was Margaret Chen, mother of tech billionaire David Chen, and my assumptions nearly destroyed both their lives and mine. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. This wasn't the usual conference presentation about new security technologies or threat assessment protocols. This was something else entirely. But this isn't a story about my mistake. It's a story about what happened after, about how a woman I humiliated chose to save me instead of destroy me. Morrison clicked to the next slide, showing a photograph of himself and Margaret standing together at a community center in Oakland, both wearing identical t-shirts that read, "Dignity has no dress code." Mrs. Chen could have sued me, had me arrested, ruined my life completely. Instead, she offered me something I'd never received before: education about my own biases. Audience shifted, some leaning forward with interest, others looking skeptical. Morrison had faced this resistance before. Security professionals prided themselves on gut instincts and quick judgments. Admitting those instincts could be wrong challenged everything they thought they knew about their jobs. I spent 3 months in what Mrs. Chen calls dignity training. Not sensitivity training, not political correctness, but learning to see people as individuals rather than categories. Morrison's voice grew stronger. I learned that I'd been profiling people my entire career, not just by race or age, but by clothes, posture, accent, economic status. I thought I was protecting buildings, but I was really protecting class barriers. A hand shot up from the audience. Morrison, isn't it our job to assess threats quickly? If we second-guess every instinct, people could get hurt. Great question. Let me ask you one back. In 8 years of security work, how many actual threats did I miss because I was too busy harassing people who looked poor? Morrison paused, letting the question sink in. The answer is 7. 7 real incidents where my attention was focused on undesirable visitors instead of actual security risks. He clicked to the next slide, showing incident reports. While I was questioning a janitor's right to be in an executive elevator, someone walked out with corporate laptops. While I was demanding extra ID from a food delivery driver, a former employee accessed restricted areas with stolen credentials. My biases didn't make the building safer, they made it less safe. Margaret Chen entered the conference room quietly, taking a seat in the back. Morrison saw her and smiled the first genuine smile many in the audience had seen from him. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet my teacher, my partner in this work, and the woman who saved my life. Mrs. Margaret Chen. The room erupted in applause. Margaret made her way to the front, moving with the quiet dignity that had captivated millions of people online. At 73, she'd become an unlikely activist, speaking at corporations, universities, and conferences about dignity and respect. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice carrying to the back of the room without amplification. "James asked me to come today because he wanted you to hear from someone who's been on the other side of security assumptions." She looked out at the audience, mostly men, mostly white, mostly middle-aged, people who'd probably never questioned their right to be anywhere, never been made to feel small by someone in uniform. "I want to tell you about my daughter-in-law, Rosa. She's a brilliant software engineer, makes more money than most people in this room. But she's also Latina, and she looks young, and she has tattoos." Margaret's voice grew warmer. "Rosa told me that she's stopped wearing casual clothes to work because security guards question her every time. She doesn't look professional enough for their standards." A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. "I want to tell you about my neighbor, Mr. Washington. He's a retired professor, has 3 degrees, served in Vietnam, but he's black, and he walks with a cane, and he sometimes wears old clothes when he goes to the library downtown. Security follows him every time." Margaret let these stories settle over the room like a gentle weight. "And I want to tell you about myself. I cleaned offices for 20 years. I know every security guard tricked the way you watch certain people. Longer, ask them more questions. Assume they don't belong in spaces they have every right to occupy." Her voice grew firmer. "I also know that most of you don't realize you're doing it." Morrison stepped forward. "Mrs. Chen and I have been working with Chen Technologies and 12 other major corporations to develop new training protocols. Not just bias awareness, but practical tools for fair and effective security." He clicked to a slide showing statistics. Buildings using the Margaret Chen protocol have seen a 40% reduction in discrimination complaints, a 30% improvement in actual security incident detection, and a 60% increase in employee satisfaction with security. "Interactions. How?" someone called out. Margaret answered, "By teaching security professionals to focus on behavior instead of appearance. By giving them tools to verify credentials properly instead of relying on assumptions. By remembering that their job is to keep people safe, not to decide who deserves respect." Morrison nodded. "We teach a simple principle. Treat every person who enters your building like they might be your boss's mother, because sometimes they are." The room chuckled, but the message was serious. "The Margaret Chen protocol isn't about political correctness," Morrison continued. "It's about doing our jobs better. It's about creating environments where everyone, employees, visitors, executives, cleaning staff, feels safe and respected." A woman in the front row raised her hand. "What about liability? If we're less suspicious, more accommodating, aren't we opening ourselves up to security breaches?" Margaret smiled. "Ma'am, may I ask what you were wearing when you walked into this conference this morning?" The woman looked confused. "A business suit. And if someone had demanded to see your credentials, questioned your right to be here, treated you like a potential threat, how would that have affected your ability to do your job today?" Understanding dawned on the woman's face. It would have been ... demoralizing. Exactly. Real security comes from creating environments where legitimate people feel welcome and supported, while actual threats stand out because they're behaving suspiciously, not because they're dressed differently. Morrison pulled up the final slide. "6 months ago, I thought my career was over. I thought my life was ruined. But Mrs. Chen showed me that mistakes can become missions, that shame can become service, that the worst moment of your life can become the beginning of the best work you'll ever do." He looked out at the audience with complete sincerity. "I'm not here to tell you to ignore your instincts. I'm here to tell you to train better instincts, to see people as individuals, not categories, to understand that dignity and security aren't opposites, they're partners." Margaret stepped forward one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, James Morrison made a terrible mistake, but he chose to learn from it, to grow from it, to use it to help others." She paused, letting her words sink in. The question isn't whether you'll make mistakes in your career. The question is, when you do, will you have the courage to face them, learn from them, and use them to make the world a little more just? The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes. But more importantly, 73 security professionals signed up for Margaret Chen protocol training before they left the conference. Morrison and Margaret had turned a moment of shame into a movement of change, but their biggest test was still coming, a test that would determine whether their partnership could survive success itself. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, exactly 1 year after the incident that changed everything. Margaret Chen's phone buzzed insistently on her nightstand, pulling her from deep sleep. The caller ID showed Morrison's name, James. "What's wrong?" Morrison's voice was tight with stress. Margaret sat up in bed, her heart sinking. "How bad? Bad. The woman's in the hospital. Been implementing our protocol at his company." Margaret closed her eyes. Marcus Williams had been one of their strongest advocates. Humiliation Margaret had endured. "I'm on my way," Margaret said. "Mrs. Chen, there's more. The media's all over this. They're saying our training doesn't work, that we're just putting Band-Aids on a broken system." Williams is furious, changed. Margaret felt the weight of every speech she'd given, every training session she'd led, every corporation that had adopted their protocol. By dawn, Margaret and Morrison were at San Francisco General Hospital, sitting in an antiseptic waiting room while Marcus Williams paced like a caged tiger. "They told my grandmother she looked suspicious because she was carrying a large bag. They said she matched the profile of someone who might be stealing from the building. Birthday party." Margaret's heart broke. They grabbed her when she tried to show them the invitation. "Just like they grabbed you, except my grandmother has a heart condition, and the stress ... Marcus's voice cracked. "She could have died because some security guard decided she looked like a thief." Morrison stepped forward. "Marcus, I know how angry you are. I know how this feels. But we can't let this destroy everything we've built. And my grandmother still ended up in the hospital because someone decided her black skin and her old clothes made her dangerous." Margaret felt the familiar ache of injustice, but also something else, determination. "Marcus, may I see your grandmother? She's sedated. The doctors don't want, please." He'd seen her speak at conferences, watched her transform Morrison from a symbol of prejudice into an advocate for change. But this was different. They were allowed into the room where Dolores Williams lay sleeping, her dark skin ashen against the white hospital sheets. Margaret approached the bed quietly, studying the face of another woman who'd been judged and found wanting by someone who'd never bothered to see her humanity. "She raised 6 children by herself," Marcus said softly, "worked 2 jobs for 40 years. Put 3 kids through college. She's the strongest person I've ever known." Morrison consulted his notes. The guard's name is Trevor Walsh, 22 years old, been on the job for 3 months. He went through our standard training program, passed all the assessments. By all measures, he should have known better, but he didn't. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Either their training was fundamentally flawed, or something else was at work here. I want to talk to him, Mrs. Chen, Marcus said sharply. This isn't like your situation. You chose to forgive Morrison, to work with him. That's your choice. But I won't let you turn my grandmother's suffering into another redemption story for some prejudiced security guard. Margaret turned to face Marcus, her voice gentle but firm. Failed, because if we can't prevent this from happening again, then everything we've done has been meaningless. 6 hours later, they sat across from Trevor Walsh in a conference room at the building management company. Walsh was young, nervous, and clearly devastated by what he'd done. His lawyer sat beside him, periodically whispering cautions about what he should and shouldn't say. Trevor, Margaret began, did you take our bias awareness training? Yes, ma'am. 8 hours of classroom instruction plus online modules. I passed with a 92%. Do you remember what we taught about appearance-based profiling? Walsh nodded miserably. You taught us to focus on behavior, not demographics. So why didn't you do that with Mrs. Williams? Walsh was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible, because I was scared. Scared of what? Of being wrong? Of missing something? Mrs. Williams. She didn't look like she belonged in that building. Happened, I'd be the one who failed. Morrison exchanged glances with Margaret. This was different from his situation. Morrison had acted from arrogance and assumption. Walsh had acted from fear and inexperience. Trevor, Margaret said carefully, did anyone tell you that your job was to keep certain types of people out? Not exactly. But ... Walsh looked at his lawyer, who nodded encouragement. During my first week, one of the senior guards told me to watch out for unusual people, he said. Most problems came from people who didn't look like they belonged. Margaret felt her stomach turn. Who was this senior guard? Morrison felt sick. They'd created official training programs. The old guard literally was still passing down biased practices to new employees. Mrs. Chen Marcus said, his anger now mixed with something else, understanding. James, how many buildings are using our protocol now? 237 nationwide. We're trying to teach. Morrison realized the scope of the problem. They'd focused on formal training programs, but they'd ignored the cultural transmission that happened between experienced and new employees. We need to start over, Margaret said quietly. Not the training itself, but how we implement it. Margaret stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the street where protesters had gathered a year ago after her own humiliation. Now they were gathering again, demanding justice for Dolores Williams. Marcus, your grandmother is going to recover this failure and build something stronger. She turned back to the room. But I won't do it without your grandmother's blessing. And I won't do it unless we're willing to acknowledge that our first attempt wasn't enough. Margaret Chen, who had transformed one security guard's prejudice into a national movement, was about to discover whether that movement could survive its own success and evolve into something even more powerful. The revolution in dignity and respect was just beginning, and its next phase would be its most challenging yet. Because changing hearts and minds, Margaret was learning, required more than good intentions and training manuals. It required confronting the deep-rooted systems that made prejudice feel not just acceptable, but necessary. The woman who had been dismissed as worthless in a lobby was about to remake the very foundations of how America's institutions treated human dignity. But first, she had to convince an angry grandson and a hospitalized grandmother that hope was still worth fighting for.